All right, so let's talk about the macromolecule carbohydrates. First, I want you to think about, what do you know about carbohydrates? Hopefully you had a few ideas as we talk about some of the actual functions of this macromolecule. I hope they align. All right, so a carbohydrate literally means hydrate of carbon, and it follows a very specific formula I want to share with you because I've been known to ask a question about this. The formula is CnH2ON. What does that mean? Think of N as being X or being any number, right? If we're looking at this mathematically, let's say we're talking about C5. N in this case is 5. If that's the case, we're going to make C5, and then N is going to be multiplied by this 2 and multiplied by an invisible 1 that we see down here. So that would make our formula for this carbohydrate C5H10O5. Another example would be C20. C20H40, because that H2O, the 2 is multiplied by 20, and then the O20. C7H14O7. So anytime you see a carbohydrate, it needs to follow that rule. Another thing about carbohydrates, as we know, they have a lot of hydroxyl groups on them, meaning that there's a lot of OH groups, and because of this, they are polar and water soluble. So throw a piece of bread in a pool of water, eventually it will dissolve. And this is exactly what happens. Think about sugar. Sugar is a carbohydrate. Throw sugar in water, it's going to make sugar water, right? It will dissolve. These are some examples that we'll talk about today: glucose, fructose, and galactose. Those are just some random examples. You might see a similarity with the naming of them, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So I'm going to throw another term at you: an isomer, not to be confused with the isotope. An isomer is a chemical that has the an identical molecular formula. So this is where we have letters and numbers, but it has a different structure. So in this case, something like C6H12O6, it has the same exact formula, but galactose, glucose, and fructose are shaped differently. This is an example of the structural formula. As you can see, there's a double bond here. This one has an H right here, while this one has an OH, right? So all these different intricacies that show that they have different structures, but they actually are all comprised of 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. So that is an isomer. Very important to make sure you don't confuse an isomer with an isotope, which is an atom that has the same number of protons but different number of neutrons. That's an isotope, different than an isomer. So what are some things about carbs? Maybe this went back to what you thought about carbs earlier. They are very important for energy. They are an immediate energy source, such as ATP, which we'll talk about in depth. And they also have a structural function. So carbohydrates have the ability to maintain structure. So a plant wall, we'll discuss, is made up of carbohydrates. Some common examples of carbohydrates are starches. And very important here, most carbohydrates, or at least a lot of them, end in OSE. They end in Ose. So you see glucose, fructose, sucrose, lactose, galactose, all of those things ending in ose is a hint to let you know that it is a carbohydrate. So with this part of the course, I think it's really important that y'all maybe come up with a chart to kind of help you identify the different macromolecules. So I'll do MM1, MM2, and maybe we can talk about it in class. All of them have different names for their monomers, and they have different names for their polymers, and also different names for their bonds. So coming up with some type of chart like this might be helpful. So a carbohydrate's monomer is called a monosaccharide. Mono means one, we know that. monosaccharide. An example of a monosaccharide are plentiful. So, an example here is glucose, fructose, galactose, ribose, which we've talked about when we're discussing RNA, and deoxyribose when we're talking about DNA. So very important and common examples of monosaccharides. That can go in your chart for the specific name of a monomer of a carbohydrate. Another one that we have in carbohydrates, which we don't have in every macromolecule, is called a disaccharide. So a disaccharide is where we have two monosaccharides together, right? You're going to have 1 and 2. Something that is specific to each macromolecule is the name of their bonds. And the name of the bond for a carbohydrate is called a glycosidic bond. So this is where we have dehydration synthesis, meaning we removed the water, right? Water left. And that's going to build our disaccharide, right? That name of that bond between those two monomers is called a glycosidic bond. So what are some examples of disaccharides? Maltose, great example of disaccharide. This is derived from barley. So if you've heard about the beer making process, what they do is they take this wheat called barley and they derive the sugar from it, which is called maltose. From that maltose, you can make, alcoholic drinks like beer. Another disaccharide is sucrose. You are familiar with sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar. So if you look on the back of your Domino sugar, it's going to either say the word sugar, or if they're sneaky, they're going to say the word sucrose. They're going to try to trick you, but now you're smart because you've been in this class. So sucrose is the table sugar name. This is the molecule that's responsible for table sugar. Because it is a disaccharide made up of two monosaccharides, your body can actually break down sucrose into the two monosaccharides it is. So this is sucrose here. Your body can break it down into glucose and into fructose. However, we often know in digesting or eating too much sucrose can cause weight gain. This is why. Because we take that fructose and we can also convert it to more glucose. Your body uses glucose for energy. If you don't do anything after you eat a candy bar, you just lay around and watch Netflix, then your body says, well, we have a lot of glucose, we're not exercising or using it, let's turn it into fat, because maybe our person's going to get up and run around the block later. Because of that, you turn that into fat. That's the reason why sugary foods can cause weight gain. You eat too much sugar in your foods, you don't exercise or take advantage of the energy, your body turns it into fat, weight gain, right? So that's a little bit of history there. Another disaccharide is lactose. So lactose is commonly found in dairy products, so anything that has milk. And what happens is people that are lactose intolerant, they actually are missing the enzyme to break lactose down into the monomers of glucose and galactose. So what happens is the lactose, the disaccharide lactose, travels through your body and your intestines as lactose. And because of that, there are actually bacteria in your intestines that love lactose. Because you can't break it down, it travels through your body whole, and when it comes across those bacteria, they're going to eat it up and be very happy, and that's going to make you feel a little sick and a little sad, right? Typically, you can break the lactose down, so by the time it gets to the bacteria, they don't want to eat it, but if you're lactose intolerant, you have too much lactose, when you get to the bacteria, they can ingest it, right? That makes it uncomfortable. So let's talk about the polysaccharides we have, which is a nice list. And one great thing about these polysaccharides, this is the name of the polymer of a carbohydrate. So this is their specific name of the polymer of a carb. It's going to be when we have many of those monosaccharides together. They're usually very large and they don't dissolve in water. Very important, they are the most abundant polymer. They are the most abundant polymer. So if you ever got a question that said, what's the most abundant or the polymer that is present in the highest numbers in the entire world, it would be a polysaccharide. And I'll tell you specifically which polysaccharide is most abundant. So some of the functions of a polysaccharide is they have some short-term energy storage, such as starch and glycogen, which we'll cover. And then also they have a number of structural components, a lot more actually, and we will discuss cellulose found in plants, peptidoglycan in bacteria, chitin in shellfish, and glycosaminoglycans found in animals. With starch, starch is just the energy storage in plants. So you've heard of starchy foods like perhaps a potato. That is going to be a plant starchy food, and it's going to, of course, give us energy, or at least it's designed to be energy for the plant. Of course, when we eat it, we can get energy as well. Glycogen is known as animal starch. So the same way a starch is energy for a plant, glycogen is energy for an animal. So a lot of times you have high amounts of glycogen when you're trying to create energy somewhere. So anybody that lifts weights, you might have heard of the term glycogen stores. Sometimes you hear bodybuilders or people talking about glycogen storage or glycogen stores that they have. That just means that you have an abundance or a buildup of glycogen in certain muscle groups. Let's say you're lifting weights in your arms. You don't want to burn out the glycogen or the energy you have. Another polysaccharide is cellulose. So cellulose is the most abundant carbohydrate. So again, if I ask what is the most abundant macromolecule, you're going to say a carb. If I ask what is the most abundant polymer, you're going to say a polysaccharide. If I say what is the most abundant polysaccharide, you will say cellulose, right? I hope you're seeing the flow of those questions. So cellulose is found in plant animal cells, and the reason it's so abundant is think about all the plants around you. So every blade of grass, every leaf on a tree, all of that has cellulose in it. And because it is the most abundant carbohydrate, a lot of times animals will interact with this carbohydrate. But one thing is known is that we cannot break it down. So once it gets in our digestive tract, we cannot break cellulose down any further than its natural structure. So it tends to serve as fiber. Fiber is going to keep you regular. If you ate, let's say, a fiber 1 bar and you looked on the ingredient list, most of the time you will see something that says cellulose. So that is something that's very common in our foods. And of course, when you eat leafy green vegetables, it's healthy for you, especially digestive wise. That's because of that cellulose we can't break down. So it goes through your digestive tract. It picks up all the junk that's there, and then you will excrete it. Another polysaccharide is peptidoglycans. So these are found in bacterial cell walls. I don't know if you've been in a microbiology class or not, but you may have heard the term gram-positive versus gram-negative. That is a test used to kind of split bacteria up into 2 different groups. And gram-positive bacteria have a very high amount of peptidoglycan, while gram-negative bacteria have a very low amount of peptidoglycan. So there's actually a lot of drugs, such as penicillin is a great example. Penicillin is a drug that will actually limit the ability of the bacteria to build this. And if it cannot build a strong structure, then of course your bacteria that's in your body will be killed, right? That's why penicillin is an antibiotic, because if it limits the building of peptidoglycan, then you don't build bacteria and you get better. So this is going to be found in bacterial cell walls. Chitin. Any of our seafood lovers, this is definitely where you see chitin. So chitin is found in the exoskeleton of a lot of shellfish, your lobster, your shrimp, your crab, and also insects like different bugs and beetles. You'll also find it on the covering of seeds. So sunflower seeds, they have that little papery covering in the seed. Also cell walls of fungi. It's kind of found in those type of items. Only thing about this is it's ingestible by humans. So if you happen to eat any type of that substance, you will just excrete it out. So it can also kind of be a fiber as well. And then our final polysaccharide is glycosaminoglycan. So glycosaminoglycans. This is found in your cartilage. So your knees, especially other joints that are weight bearing, within the cartilage, there's going to be a squishy substance that makes up this extracellular matrix, and that is comprised of glycosaminoglycan. So very, very important that we have that. That's going to keep our joints and our knees and weight bearing areas kind of squishy so that we don't hurt ourselves. So that wraps up carbohydrates. We're going to take a break, and the next video will be about lipids.